For Love of a Vampire by Eileen Sheehan. Notice: portions of this story may prove too graphic, sexually explicit, or violent for sensitive readers. This novel is intended for adult readers. Chapter 1. Jane Wells. Where are you? I covered my ears with my hands. The old crone's screeching was enough to make me want to rip them from my head. Mildred Elliott's squalling voice grated on my nerves like nails against a blackboard. I'd told her so on more than one frustrated occasion. It had little impact on the old woman, other than reinforcing her viewpoint that I was a bit odd in the head. Mildred hadn't a clue what a blackboard was. They weren't invented yet. That came years later, around the turn of the 19th century, when a headmaster in Scotland named James Pylons got it into his head to frame a piece of slate for the school's use. The screeching old crone I was fervently dodging happened to be located in England in the year 1745. I didn't belong in that time or place. I was a covert transient from the 21st century. I'd traveled back in time for one purpose only: to change the future for the one I loved. I was never very good at planning things out. I'm more of a grab the seat of my pants and go kind of girl. Patience has also never been one of my strongest virtues. Historically, this grab-and-go habit always worked for me. Somehow, I managed to achieve my goals. This time I wasn't so sure. Had I jumped the gun without adequate preparation? I'd arrived outside the village of Colchester, England, almost 7 weeks earlier. The first thing I did was steal what had to be the scratchiest, most abrasive bodice, skirt, and gown in existence. I'm not a thief by nature. It's just that, since I'd jumped back in time without considering what I was going to wear, I needed to do something. Jeans, a t-shirt, and a hoodie weren't the proper attire for someone trying to blend in. I spotted the apparel drying on a bush behind a little farm cottage, not far from the cave where I'd teleported into the 18th century, and grabbed what I could. As luck would have it, the owner and I were close in size. Over time, I managed to acquire a few more necessities for my needs. Jane, the old crone, screamed out so loud I was sure she was going to go hoarse. "Where are you, gal? The washing will not tend to itself." I held my breath as I waited for her to finish her bellowing. "Fie, the wench will be the death of me," she muttered. I felt a little guilty about referring to Mildred Gould to an old crone, even if she did look the part with her piercing black eyes and hawk-like, wart-infested nose. If she was in the 20th century, she could have easily gotten the part of the Wicked Witch of the West in the Wizard of Oz film. The makeup department wouldn't have had to do a thing, except paint her green. She'd shown me a bit of kindness and deserved a little more consideration and compassion from me. After all, there were no plastic surgeons around to help the poor woman out. Mildred and her oversized husband, Carl, owned a busy little inn on the edge of town on the main road of travel. They were not a bad sort, as persons of the times went. They lived a life comfortable enough to keep them above the pits of poverty, but not sufficient enough for them to rub elbows with the upper class in any way other than catering to their needs on the occasions a lord or lady saw fit to patronize their little establishment. The innkeepers belonged to a branch of society destined to be labeled the middle class. Mildred was good enough to take me in and give me a roof over my head, a uniform, and food. I was fed a decent portion of gruel in the morning to start my day. In the evening, I was provided with a sparse portion of hard-crusted bread with the tiniest bit of butter, bland potatoes boiled in oxtail broth with an occasional piece of meat stuck to them, and weak ale. In exchange for these I worked, and worked, and worked some more. I was left with about 2 shillings at the end of the month, when all was said and done. I continually had to remind myself that in a time when generosity and kindness were not at optimum, with no governmental social services to fall back on, I was lucky to have stumbled upon the inn almost immediately after arriving. Talk about serendipity. As unprepared as I was for survival, I might have been forced to go into a workhouse. So, why was I hiding from good old Mildred? I'd stolen again. I'd just finished hiding a crisp white falling band and a pair of beautifully embroidered mules amongst my other stolen goods, and I needed time to compose myself. I'd made good use of time, since teleporting from the future, to acclimate to their ways and culture. I spent every waking moment studying the language, style of dress, politics, mode of living, etc. Working at an inn located on a heavily traveled road gave me the opportunity to witness a variety of life. I saw travelers from varied social stations enter and stay in the humble place of food and rest. I was grateful for the linguistic lessons I took to enhance my acting skills. I was able to pick up the dialect of both the tavern workers and the elite who occasionally passed through. Since I still hadn't worked out how I was going to pull off my mission, I needed to be prepared to pass as a person of whatever social standing proved beneficial for me to be successful. Feeling confident in the versatility of my linguistic skills, it was time to move on to the next stage of my mission. I had to do what I could to change the course of history for Duncan. This was my one and only chance. If I was unsuccessful, he would be doomed to a life he despised, a life that saddened him to the core. The life of a vampire. I first met Duncan Colliers at the neighborhood bar located just below my apartment in Queens. I hooked up with my friends, Doug, Chuck, and Linda, at Patty's Pub every Thursday night for a ritual of a few drinks and a few games of billiards. It was 10:30, and I was leaning against the wall and casually rolling a cue stick between my palms while I waited for my turn at the table. I was in between acting jobs, but my friends had to work the next day. We were just about to call it a night when I felt Duncan enter. His presence was so strong and commanding, there was no way I couldn't feel it. I don't know if everyone felt him, probably not, but since I'm a little bit psychic and extremely sensitive, there was no getting his arrival past me. Just as I knew there was something uniquely different about him, he recognized a difference in me. He said I stood out from the rest of the room and was like a beacon of light in the gloom of his existence. Who knew such a corny comment could send shivers of delight up and down my spine like it did? I watched him out of the corner of my eye while my friends and I finished the game and said our goodbyes. I pretended to leave with my friends. After we parted ways, I waited in the foyer of my building until I was sure they wouldn't see me before heading back into the bar. I brazenly sat on the stool next to him. I knew the bartender, Julie, so it was easy to find an excuse to justify my presence. He never let on, but I'm pretty sure he saw through my charade. I didn't have to wait long before he struck up a conversation with me. We talked until Julie made last call. He asked me to meet him the following night. I agreed. The next night, he asked me to meet him the night after that. I agreed again. Then the following night, we agreed to get together the next night, and so on. Never once did he mention he was a vampire. Never once did I see signs of him being a vampire. Never once would I have even considered he would be a vampire. First of all, I didn't believe vampires really existed. Secondly, from what I'd read in books and seen in films, vampires were quite grotesque with long nails, red lips, and piercing yellow eyes. Duncan's hands were extremely well manicured, his lips were normal in color, his eyes were a delicious seafoam blue, and his hair was the color of sun-kissed wheat. He stood half a foot taller than my 5'5" and moved with the grace, beauty, and self-confidence that radiated wealth and good breeding. Everything about him spoke of rich kid from the right side of the European tracks, nothing more. We'd been together for a few months before I learned of his true nature. It wasn't as if he'd intended to show me. He confessed sometime later that he'd feared showing me his true self because he worried I'd walk away if he did. That was a natural fear. I'd probably feel the same if the situation was reversed. In fact, it was in a way. He may have been keeping his vampire identity a secret from me, but I was doing pretty much the same thing. Not that I was a vampire, because I wasn't. I was a psychic and a sensitive who dabbled in magic, real magic, not that of an illusionist. Could I have been called a witch? I wouldn't have called myself that. I practiced no rituals and belonged to no covens. I simply had abilities to feel and sense things. I occasionally saw and spoke to spirits, although the ability wasn't something I had a lot of control over, and I possessed a strong curiosity and interest in alchemy. One night, after visiting my favorite occult bookstore, I was followed by a small group of freaky-looking characters. There were 5 or 6 of them. From what I could tell, they were all boys, but I could be wrong. They wore their hair in a green, orange, and blue punk spike. I assumed it was some sort of gang symbol, like them all having the same tattoo or something. They sported leather-studded jackets and body piercings of indescribable locations and amounts. This was in stark contrast to my designer jeans, navy wool peacoat with a matching beret that was pinned just right on my fashionably braided long, honey blonde hair, pear-studded earrings, and Movado watch. I was wearing green and tan pumps and carried a green and tan Liz Claiborne crossover bag to match. They actually had the audacity to taunt me for being weird because I'd bought a few things at a spooky occult store. Imagine that? I did my best to ignore them while I picked up my pace. Unfortunately, they were itching for a confrontation. Since I'd never considered myself a fighter or the least bit brave, I did the only thing I could think to do. I ran. Right into a dead-end alley. Before I knew what was happening, I was on the ground with those punks ransacking my Liz Claiborne shoulder bag, pulling at the pockets of my peacoat, and tossing the contents of my shopping bag back and forth between each other. In my struggles to be free and salvage what I could, I'd managed to obtain a few cuts and bruises. Unfortunately, due to poor blood coagulation, I bled a lot more than one would have expected wounds of that nature to bleed. Needless to say, even though my wounds weren't really bad, my type of positive blood was all over the place. What happened next I can only say was so far-fetched. Had I not known better, I would have thought I was dreaming. There was a loud swooshing sound. I heard it clearly above the cackling of the haughty attackers as they reveled in their torment of me. Either they didn't hear it or they just didn't care because they kept on doing their utmost best to rob me of all I had to offer, my dignity included. A loud anguished cry brought the entire scene to a standstill while everyone focused on the source. As my assailant slowly backed away from me, I witnessed a sight that burned so deep in my memory I'm sure I'll carry it with me forever. 2 vampires stood over me. Their mouths dripped with the blood of several of my tormentors who now lay in a heap on the ground nearby. It's strange what goes on in one's mind when facing death. I'd always been told my life would flash before my eyes chronologically. That didn't happen. Perhaps it was because in some crazy way I didn't think what happened to my attackers would happen to me, or perhaps it was because I'd been misinformed. I couldn't say. There was certainly no walking down memory lane. Instead of reviewing my almost 19 years of life, I studied the faces of my soon-to-be slaughterers. I stared deep into their eyes, while noticing the kaleidoscope glow that shot light from their pupils like one of those mini flashlights on keychains. I felt their rage permeate my surroundings. One vampire was male and one female, but both radiated equally angry power. Had I not seen them and only been privy to their energy, I would have been hard-pressed to decipher gender. Their faces were distorted. It wasn't just their anger causing it. Their bones were, how do I put it? Off. They looked animalistic. These were like the faces you'd expect to see on the silver screen. Exactly. I looked beyond the distorted bone structure of the female and decided she was a beautiful woman when she was in human state. She must have felt my energy piercing through her vampire veil because she stopped advancing and stared at me, as if bewildered. The male, on the other hand, kept on coming. I could smell his foul breath as he closed in on me. His halitosis was so horrific, I gasped for air. I cringed at the long, pointed nails on his hands when he reached to grab my shoulders. They resembled claws. Even while he was lifting me effortlessly to my feet, I couldn't help confirming that the nails matched the vampire stories as well. It was hard to tell how his lips compared since they were dripping of blood and were overshadowed by elongated fawn-like teeth at the moment, but his eyes actually flashed some sort of red spark from them. It wasn't quite like a strobe light, but more like a neon light gone bad. As crazy as it sounds, I'd yet to fear for my life. My feet were several inches off the ground when I heard, as well as felt, the swoosh of someone else arriving. It was an energy I recognized, but I couldn't place it in my chaotic state. I twisted my head as best I could to look for the familiar. Through the entire ordeal, I'd stayed relatively numb. Now, I was finally shocked. There, only feet away from me, stood Duncan, my Duncan, or a version of him, anyway. His face was not as distorted in the animalistic manner as my captor's, but it certainly wasn't the handsome face I'd made love to over the last few months. Long canines projected from his beautiful set of brilliant white choppers. His normally rosy cheeks were sunken and hollow. His seafoam blue eyes were so dark they could have been mistaken for black. I gasped more with surprise than with fear while I watched him tear the heads off my assailants with rapid speed and incredible ease. It brought to mind my brother's slaughter of my dolls when we were kids. I fell to the ground along with my headless attacker and quickly pried myself from its lifeless vice grip. I stayed breathless and motionless while I watched Duncan look around with disgust before he scooped me into his arms. He half ran, half flew across rooftops to my apartment building, with me in his arms as if I weighed no more than a feather. He quickly found the doorway from the roof to the stair-well and continued until he deposited me on my living room sofa. Without a word, or allowing time for me to gather my wits to comprehend the reality of what was happening, he disappeared. For whatever reason, probably shock, I decided to play Scarlett O'Hara and deal with what happened another day. I immediately went to bed. Believe it or not, I slept like a baby that night. One would have never guessed I'd been through such an ordeal. It wasn't until the following morning, when I turned on the news and saw the report of the dead bodies of the punks who'd tried to mug me, that reality struck and I collapsed from the trauma of it all. Chapter 2. I came to my senses by evening and called Duncan's cell phone. No answer. So, I tried his house phone. Again, no answer. This went on for days. Thinking me disgusted and frightened by his true identity, he'd gone into hiding. It took almost 2 weeks for him to resurface. I used this time of separation from my lover to study and research as much as I could about vampires. I ran across a statement that stuck in my head and just kept playing over and over. God makes and loves all things and all creatures. It's man who decides what's evil and what's not. It was so true. Sure, the vampires that attacked me and my group of muggers were bad, but so were the muggers. There are good and bad in all species. I knew in my heart of hearts that Duncan was good. If the truth was to be known, even if he was bad, it was too late. I'd already fallen in love with him. I felt Duncan standing in the hall before he gathered the courage up to tap quietly on my door. He'd expected me to scream and refuse to open the door. Instead, I'd surprised him with my wild abandoned welcome. I swung the door open and flew into his arms, kissing him wildly. In turn, he surprised me by trembling from the sheer joy of my acceptance of him. It was a powerful reunion. We spent the next few days making love and bearing the deepest secrets about ourselves. I learned Duncan was turned just days before his wedding was to take place in the year 1745. He'd never encountered supernatural creatures such as vampires, so he never thought to take heed of the stories or precautions while traveling certain roads alone at night. There were rumors that Lady Vivian Everhoust, the season's most eligible debutante who was madly in love with Lord Duncan and made no secret of it, dabbled in witchcraft. When she realized Lord Duncan planned on going through with the union with another woman, she assured him that his black heart would be devoured by one even blacker and he would live eternity in darkness and remorse. Duncan considered her words the idle threat of a thwarted woman and paid it very little mind. He never saw it coming. After his change, he faked his death and moved away. He confessed that, although he spent his time traveling and experiencing the world, the sadness of leaving that he carried with him over the centuries had, little by little, chiseled away at his heart. Lady Vivian had gotten her revenge. He and his future bride were sweethearts since childhood. The marriage banns were read early in their life and were to be fulfilled when she turned 18 and Duncan was 25. He told me this sadness only began to lift when he met me. He couldn't or wouldn't tell me why, just that when he met me, he found hope for his future. What type of hope? He didn't say. Just hope. I believed him. I shared my own secrets. I told how I'd kept my abilities close to my chest for fear of being ostracized by my fellow man. Even though times were progressing, I still found myself uncomfortable admitting my true nature. Look what happened on the street with those punks simply because I'd made a purchase at an occult shop. Surely that was sufficient evidence to support my hesitancy. Duncan agreed. Intrigued by my abilities and skills, Duncan pressed as much information from me as he could. He'd met plenty of people with my talents over the centuries and was certain he could find someone to help me perfect them. It was such a twist to have support for my skills and actual encouragement to use and enhance them. I hadn't really thought about working with them, nor was it really important to me to do so, but if learning more about the arts of alchemy was part of the being with Duncan package, then I was willing to give it a shot. He introduced me to an ancient witch named Isabel. When I say ancient, I really do mean ancient. Isabel was almost as old as Duncan, yet she looked not a day over 40. How did she accomplish this? That was part of my lesson plan. I could hardly wait. Once I'd moved through the jealousy of discovering that Isabel and Duncan were once an item, I was able to relax and actually enjoy her company, tutelage, and eventual friendship. She confided that I was the first person Duncan ever asked her to instruct. It pleased her. I pleased her. Apparently, she didn't harbor my insecurities. I couldn't detect a jealous bone in her body from the moment we met. Her lack of jealousy bothered me enough to spend longer than usual in front of a mirror, scrutinizing my looks. Isabel had porcelain skin, an oval face with a Vivian Leigh chin, dark dancing eyes, and thick black hair that traveled down her back like a sensual waterfall. We couldn't have been more opposite. Whenever my jealous monster raised his ugly head and insecurities reigned supreme, I reminded myself that without her magic she'd be a hag, or a skeleton, since she would have been long dead by now. As the wisdom of the ages poured forth from my mentor, our friendship grew naturally. It soon became clear that we had a lot more than Duncan in common. Isabel was impressed with the education I'd given myself. It may have been limited, but it was thorough. She used this education as a platform to build upon. It wasn't long before I was casting spells and transforming materials. It took the better part of a year of intense study for Isabel to announce she felt I was ready to learn to teleport. We started small at first. I'd move a pencil or a book from one side of the room to the other. Eventually, I graduated to bigger items and greater distances. During this time, I moved in with Duncan and gave up the waitress job I worked to support myself while I pursued a career in acting. This allowed me to focus completely on my studies with Isabel. It was Isabel's idea, but Duncan agreed wholeheartedly. He took delight in watching me develop from a bud to a flower. It was a corny phrase, I know, but I liked it. Actually, finding out his true age and era of birth did wonders for us both. It allowed us to relax with each other. Duncan was no longer forced to monitor his style of speech and often slipped back into an antiquated pattern of speaking. For the first time in years, he was able to be himself, with no fear of judgment or chaos. With a natural curiosity and desire to perfect my dialect for my future career in acting, I delighted at every opportunity to mimic him and query him on words and their meanings. We were an ideal couple. He felt it, I felt it, and much to my surprise and delight, Isabel voiced it. Now that I was learning from Isabel, the fear of Duncan outliving me no longer cast a shadow on our relationship. What did, was his sadness for being a creature of the night. Being a sensitive can be difficult at times. Some days I could hardly bear the sorrow that I picked up from him. It was almost crippling. I discussed this with Isabel, and we came up with a solution. Isabel would anchor me to the present, while I went back in time and stopped Duncan from being turned into a vampire. Then, I would bring him back to the future with me, where Isabel would work her magic on him to prevent him from aging. After which, we would live happily ever after. What a great idea! We approached Duncan with our great idea. He surprised me by opposing it. Apparently, he was far more informed on the rewards, perils, and pitfalls of magic than we gave him credit for. He was fully aware of the risk both Isabel and I were taking by sending me back in time. He would have no part of it. "It warms my heart that you love me enough to want to do this for me," he said to us both, "but I cannot let you go through with it." He took Isabel's hands in his. "It is my understanding that you must do more than simply anchor Jane. She is not yet developed enough to do this on her own. You will have to use much of your own magic in order to make this happen. I am correct with this, am I not?" Isabel looked away while I gasped. This was a bit of information she'd neglected to share with me. "Is this true?" I asked quietly. "Yes, it is," she whispered, "but I have no doubt you will be able to succeed, dear Jane. It is worth the risk to me." She looked Duncan in the eyes. "I have loved you for so long, but my love has never given you the joy I see in your eyes and feel in your heart whenever you are near Jane. If we can find a way to remove this blackness that burdens your heart and make you whole again to live and love, I want to try. To see you happy, truly happy, would bring me the greatest pleasure. If you ever cared for me, you won't deny me this. What will happen to you? What risk are we talking about?" I demanded, more than asked. It was all fine and dandy that Isabel chose this moment to act out some scene of a romance novel and sacrifice herself for her love, but if it meant her life, well, I wasn't that selfless. I'd grown attached and a little dependent on Isabel as a friend and a tutor. I wasn't all that eager to give her up. "She risks losing her magic," Duncan stated flatly. His eyes never left Isabel's. "I won't," Isabel protested. "How can you be so sure?" I interjected. "If you lose your magic, what happens then?" I already knew the answer, but I still needed to hear someone say it. It was Duncan who did the honors. "She turns to dust," he said flatly. "But, it's your era. You were born then, how could you turn to dust?" I asked with confusion. "Is your magic at risk if you help me from here?" I demanded, "Be truthful." She nodded slowly. "I did not simply travel through time to get here. I used magic to live through time. Because of this, my cells have matured and would remember that I should be long dead if the magic that keeps them alive leaves me," she said sadly. "It would be risky for me to teleport back to the time when I was born. My cells might reject the magic of the future. I would have to help you from here. If you run into trouble and I have to stretch across time with my magic, it is possible I would have to use too much of it without being able to replenish it." "In which case she would turn to dust," Duncan interjected. "Oh, hell no!" I bellowed. "Duncan, I love you. You know I do. I feel really bad about your sorrow about being a vampire. I want to help you. I do. But I can't risk killing Isabel in order to do it." "Nor can I," he stated passionately. For a brief moment I forgot I'd worked through my jealousy over those two having been a one-time couple as I watched them look into each other's eyes and basically reminisce of days gone by. My psychic abilities were working overtime. I was able to witness what they shared in my mind's eye. They'd been together in an era far more romantic than the times we lived in now. the romance and chivalry was wonderful. I felt cheated. It seemed so unfair that I'd never be privy to experiencing a life of privilege and romance of this magnitude. I struggled to subdue the green-eyed monster that threatened to creep up on me. Duncan loved me body and soul. There was no mistaking it. He had a history with Isabel. He loved her, true, but in a way far different than he loved me. She was no threat. Furthermore, she was my friend. For what seemed like the 100th time, I mentally chastised myself for my insecurities. Is that the only danger? I blurted out, forcing them to return to the here and now. No, Isabel sighed. There is more. When you work against nature and time, like we desire to do, there is always danger. Tell me, I said as steadily as I could. She did tell you there's a chance you could get stuck there, did she not? Duncan asked. Chapter 3. Isabel's warnings were significant, but not enough to change my mind, even if Duncan was able to change hers. It took some time before Duncan managed to convince Isabel that our plan was a bad idea. By the time he did, I'd already learned enough to do it on my own, if need be. Once my mind was made up, I took the time to study enough on the sly until I was able to work a spell to teleport myself through time without risking Isabel, by using her as my anchor. When no one suspected what I was up to, I did just that. I'd cast a spell to travel back in time far enough in advance of the attack on Duncan to allow time to find him, meet him, gain his trust, and then return to the future with him before the fateful attack could take place. I was to return no later than the day before the attack. I hadn't the skills to elongate my visit. If we missed the opening of the portal of time, I wasn't sure I'd be able to work a new spell while in the past. If I'd been teleporting to the future, I wouldn't have been as concerned. Going back several centuries before my birth put a different slant on things. Now, here I was, crouched behind an outbuilding hiding from screeching Mildred, while I looked for a way to sneak off with my little trunk of mainstays and the coin I stole from the recesses of a traveling gentry's receptacle. I hadn't taken all he had and, since I'd heard no mention of it, I doubted he discovered its absence before returning home and unpacking. I felt bad for the servants who unpacked him. Surely they would get the blame, but what was I to do? I couldn't function without it. I also had in my possession a small traveler's trunk with a new kirtle, a gown of velvet, a gown of silk, a spare chemise, traveler's shoes, house shoes, a cape, and other accessories. I'd snuck each article, bit by bit, from rooms of gentry staying at the inn over my weeks of working there. I wasn't sure what role the gentry I'd stolen from played in society, but the embroidered fabric seemed of quality velvet, wool, silk, and linen and a cut fashionable enough for me to believe them of a reasonable status. I managed to hide the little traveler's trunk in the recesses of the older, less used stable under an enormous pile of hay until things cooled down. The last thing I needed was to be attached to theft. Prison wasn't on my agenda. Oh, Duncan, my love. The things I do for you. I needed to leave, but I also needed to time it just right. I could feel Duncan's energy all around me. The time was close for me to connect with him. I could feel it. I just couldn't hone in on it. If only Mildred would stop her screeching and let me think. There was no hope for that. I heaved a sigh and hoisted myself from the squatting position I'd curled up in behind a coop. My feet felt like lead as I forced myself to return to duties I certainly wouldn't miss when I was finally free of them. At least I would be left alone to think while doing the laundry. Their methods of washing and hygiene had a lot to be desired. The caustic soaps and boiling water practically tore the flesh from my slender fingers. A messenger notified Mildred of a small party of aristocracy that would be stopping for the night. The inn was in a frenzy preparing for the guests. I had no idea who they were, but they were important enough to warrant the cleanest sheets in the county and a meal of roast chicken, rosemary potatoes, apple pie, and Brussels sprouts, while the rest of the guests made do with mutton stew. When I heard Carl ordering a barrel of his finest wine to be brought up from the cellars, my curiosity was piqued. my duties didn't include serving the guests. This made it necessary for me to be creative in finding ways to monitor them. Normally, I would stay in the shadows and study their language and mannerisms. I'd managed to find a spot that only Kitty, the scullery maid, knew about. There were times when she'd squeeze in next to me, but most of the time she was too busy making sure food didn't burn or performing one of the grueling tasks the cook forced upon her. During these times, Mildred and Carl were so busy skittering around to make sure their guests were fat and happy, my whereabouts was never a curiosity. The party was rather large for the little inn, but somehow Mildred and Carl found rooms to accommodate them. This resulted in extra chores and duties for the staff, me included. I was so busy making up rooms that I completely missed the pomp and circumstance when the first of the party arrived. I was informed by other members of staff that there were 5 men and 2 women of almost royal status. Apparently, they were to be guests at the inn for an anticipated few days while they awaited the arrival of the Earl of Winterspring and yet another small party, who was delayed in London. Once he caught up with them, they would travel on to his estate. It was not uncommon for guests to await the lord of a manor in his home, but this particular party was anticipating the arrival of a young woman who was promised in marriage to the Earl's son. They had not seen each other in months, during which time the Earl renovated one wing of the particular property of their destination as a gift to his son's bride-to-be. He wanted to be by her side when first she laid eyes upon her future home. Finally, after weeks of toil and monotony, I was privy to the chivalrous romanticism I attributed to these historic times, among the fortunate at least. I couldn't help being a little envious of this bride-to-be when I considered the overtures taken to make her feel at home and happy in her new family. I couldn't imagine a father of my time going through such a process to please his daughter-in-law. The extra workload thrust upon me was taking its toll. I was eager for the Earl to arrive and whisk his party of elite away. He was expected to arrive at any time and it was none too soon for me. I was exhausted. I doubted there was 1 inch of my body that didn't ache right down to the marrow of my bones. People were less rushed in that day and time, but the lower class toiled and labored significantly more than someone of the 20th century. I wasn't prepared for it, mentally or physically. I was at the washing station tending to the never-ending pile of linens when I heard the commotion coming from the kitchen. Cook was in an uproar. When the Earl sent his man ahead to notify the inn of his pending arrival, he'd actually put in a menu request. From what I'd witnessed during my time there, special requests for dinner were only granted to the elite. It was one thing for Cook to kill a chicken or 2, but an absolute different thing altogether for Cook to send servants willy-nilly to market in search of ingredients rarely kept in the inn's humble kitchen. Whoever the Earl was, he was an important man in these parts. I decided it was time to find out a little more about him. Perhaps he could be a lead to finding Duncan. "Ho there," I called to the buxom tavern maid, Sally, as she waddled past toward the milk-house. "I bid you what happens?" "No time to chat, love. His lordship is nearly here," she said with a huff. "What lordship?" I called out as I watched her waddle by at a speed that was far too quick to be normal for a larger-than-average body that was proportioned as awkwardly as hers was. Sally stopped for a moment and stared at me, as if seeing me for the first time. Her oversized green eyes almost bulged away from her round, rosy-cheeked face as the disbelief of what I was implying hit her. "Truly, you know naught of the Earl?" she asked incredulously. "None," I said as I shook my head. "How can that be? Where be you from?" she asked as she spied me closely. My explanation to Mildred upon my arrival was scant and brief, yet believable. It was the story that Isabel and I started to work on when we conjured up the idea of my traveling back in time. Unfortunately, once Duncan swayed Isabel's thoughts on the matter, the storyline went unfinished and I'd had to improvise. Even so, telling Mildred that I was a foreign elite accounted for my odd pattern of speech. Claiming that my family's ship perished at sea explained why I was left to find my own way. I had no family in England and all of my money was washed away with the ship. It was agreed between us that I would work for my keep while I sent word to my homeland of my tragedy and awaited rescue. Now that sufficient time had passed, it was not only Mildred who was expecting a fine carriage to pull up and whisk me away like some fairy princess. It appeared the staff was starting to question my story as well. It was definitely time to leave. You know I come not from here. Why would I know this, Earl? I snapped, hoping my aggression would halt any further questioning from her. There was a long moment of deafening silence between us. My nerves jumped to attention as the adrenaline needed to flee one's pursuer surfaced. I felt trapped. What would I do if the tavern maid saw through me? If my memory served me correctly, they were still performing witch hunts. If anyone caught wind that I'd traveled from the future, let alone that I knew a certain amount of alchemy, they'd hang me for sure, or worse, burn me. I could feel the bile creeping up my esophagus from my wrenching stomach. I swallowed it down, while doing my best to look calm, cool, and oh so tough. It worked. His lordship, she said, emphasizing her words dramatically, is only the richest man in these parts. He owns half the county side. I knew I was pressing my luck on several accounts. One was that, because of Sally's lowly station, it was probable she wouldn't be able to answer me. Two was because I was risking showing just a little too much interest in the richest man in the county. I asked anyway, truly? Pray, does he know the Earl of Winterspring? The look of disdain she slapped at me was enough to knock me over. Had I not been holding onto a sheet I'd just draped over the line, I very well might have sat down on the muddy ground. You jest, surely, she screeched incredulously. I shook my head. ACH, she eked out as she waved her hand in the air as if to dismiss me and started toward the milk house. Pray, tell me. I called after her. As foolish as I felt, I just couldn't give up. He is the Earl of Winterspring, she held over her shoulder, never giving me a second look. With that, I did sit down. Duncan's father was coming. What should I do? I wasn't ready. I still had no plan. It wouldn't do for him to find me scrubbing laundry at an inn. From all I'd learned about the classes of 18th century England, I'd be lucky to get him to spit in my direction, let alone let me get close enough to do what needed to be done. Why are you dawdling about, gal? Mildred wailed from the back door of the tavern. There is no time for daydreaming. The Earl is to arrive any minute now. Come on, get cracking. I need you inside to help out. I am doing my best, Mum, I called out. 'Twill only take a bit longer. See that it does, Mildred grumbled. She watched me briefly with her hands on her hips, as if to make it a point she was in no mood for slackers, and then moved back into the inn. I plunged back into the chore of dealing with boiling lye water. The romantic setting I'd witnessed while watching Duncan and Isabel reminisce was nowhere to be found in the Colchester I was experiencing. The nobility and gentry were a minority. The chores I drudged through each day were only a fraction of the chores the average resident did on a daily basis just for survival. I learned that most of the income in the small villages in the county went to pay taxes, and the crops available to the villagers were barely enough to sustain them. It was a sad, sad scene. If UNICEF and the Peace Corps were around, they'd be kept busy. This has been chapters 1, 2, and 3 of For Love of a Vampire by Eileen Sheehan. Read by Jenny.